So we're picking up where we left off from reading on Thursday in Great Gatsby Chapter 1. We've got Nick Carraway, our narrator. He's been invited over to dinner by his cousin Daisy and her husband Tom Buchanan to their big, beautiful mansion in East Egg, which is all old money. And Jordan Baker, the famous golfer, who is Daisy's friend, is also there. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite curiosity out of a pale, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her, somewhere before. "You live in West Egg," she remarked contemptuously. "I know somebody there." "I don't know a single—" "You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" demanded Daisy. "What Gatsby?" Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set upon their hips, the two young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. "In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day of the year." She looked at us all radiantly. "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" "I always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it." "We ought to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. "All right," said Daisy. "What'll we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "Look," she complained, "I heard it." We all looked. The knuckle was blue and black. "You did it, Tom," she said accusingly. "I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great big, hulking, physical specimen of a— I hate that word, hulking," objected Tom crossly, "even in kidding." "Hulking," insisted Daisy. "You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy," I confessed on my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. "Can't you talk about crops or something?" I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. "Civilization's going to pieces," Tom broke out violently. "I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard?" "Why, no," I answered, rather surprised by his tone. "Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved." "Tom's getting very, very profound," said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. "He reads deep books with long words in them." "What was that word Well, these books are all scientific," insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. "This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out for these or other races will have control of things." So let's pause here for a second. So we've just learned something interesting about Tom. He's going on and on about a book that he read that proves scientifically that the white race is the best race and that every other race is inferior, is not as good as them. So what we can conclude about Tom is that he is a racist man. So we'll be sure to add that to our character chart when we get back to school. Starting right here at the top. "We've got to beat them down," whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. "You ought to live in California," began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. "The idea is we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and—" After a small hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. "And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see?" Almost immediately, the telephone rang inside, and the butler left the porch. Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. "I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose?" This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only talking absently, but a stirring warmth flowed from her as if her heart were trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house toward Tom. So here we're getting a little glimpse of conversation between these people. And the conversation that Daisy seems to make is kind of empty. She calls her cousin Nick a rose. He reminds her of a rose. What does that even mean? We're not even sure. And it's hard to tell, the author says, if Daisy is being sincere or if she's just trying to fill space with her words. The last thing she does is she goes inside the house where Tom has gone in to take a telephone call. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak up when she sat up alertly and said, "Shh," in a warning voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of understanding, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. What this paragraph tells us is that Miss Baker is listening. There's a heated conversation happening between Tom and Daisy just inside the room. They seem to be arguing about something, maybe trying to be quiet, but then losing themselves and talking louder again, and she's trying to hear. "This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor," I said. "Don't talk. I want to hear what happens." "Is something happening?" I inquired innocently. "You mean to say you don't know?" said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. "I thought everybody knew." "I don't." "Why," she said hesitantly, "Tom's got some woman in New York." "Got some woman?" I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. So pause here. What that means, that Tom has got some woman in New York, is that Tom is cheating on his wife Daisy with another woman who lives in New York City. She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was a flutter of a dress and the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. "It couldn't be helped," cried Daisy with tensed gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and continued, "I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn, and I think that it must be a nightingale come over on the Kernet or White Star Line. He's singing away," her voice sang. "Isn't it romantic? Isn't it, Tom?" "Very romantic," he said, and then miserably to me, "If it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables." The telephone rang again inside, startlingly. And as Daisy shook her head at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at the table, I remember the candles being lit, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill, metallic urgency out of her mind. That's very interesting here, you guys. The fifth guest. So the fifth guest at this table is now the telephone, and on the other end of that telephone is the woman that Tom is cheating on Daisy with. Everyone knows it, and yet they're all trying to, in this paragraph, to avoid that very topic, looking back and forth at one another, talking about very silly, superficial things, not talking about the one thing they all know. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. So now Nick and his cousin Daisy are sitting outside on the front porch together alone. Daisy took her face in her hands, as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly, "even if we are cousins. You didn't come to my wedding." "I wasn't back from the war." That's true, she hesitated. Well, I've had a very time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything. Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. I suppose she talks and eats and everything. Oh, yes. She looked at me absently. Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear? Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether and was an utterly abandoned feeling and asked the nurse right away if it was boy or girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said. I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so. The most advanced people. And I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything. Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated. So we're going to pause here and look carefully at these lines. Daisy said she's cynical. What that means is she doesn't have a lot of view of hope in the world. She thinks the world is overall kind of a hopeless place and nothing really works out. This is where we can see a little bit about the modernist era in our writing. So when everyone came back from World War One, remember that the soldiers, we had trench warfare. They thought it was going to be a very quick war, and it ended up lasting for years and killing millions of men. So the people who did come home, they felt like they were lost. They were even called the lost generation. So they felt like they didn't have a place in the world, like nothing was ever going to be safe again. And so the people who grew up in that time started to feel that way too. So we can see a little bit of that era in Daisy's lines. So we're going to pause here for now. And if you would please return to E-class for your question about this reading.